this is really about the doctrine of discovery and what its roots, about its roots and its effects on, actually world colonization and America, specifically United States and Canada, Northern America. So, this is, I just, well, let's just take a look at it and see how you think. I'm interested in capturing reactions and some vulnerability in talking about how we respond and what this looks like today and where we can go. So how does it impact us? Let's start with prayer, shall we? Gracious Heavenly Creator, thank you for being with us today as we take a look at this tough subject, this tough, eye-opening thing that would be far more comfortable to leave buried, except that it separates and divides. Please open our ears and our eyes so that we can hear this as it's intended and act on this in love. Amen.
Yak Mark Charles Inishya. Sin bake denan nishle to toy haglini bashes chin. Sin bake denan bashes che to the cheat ni bashanella. In the Navajo culture, when you introduce yourself, you always name your 4 clans. We're a matrilineal people, and our identities come from our mother's mother. Now, my mother's mother happens to be American of Dutch heritage, and so I say Sin bake denan nishle, which translated means I'm from the wooden shoe people. My second clan, my father's mother, is Tohiglini, which is the waters that flow together. My third clan, my mother's father, is also Tsinbake Dinea. And my fourth clan, my father's father, is Totachitni, and that's the Bitterwater clan. It's one of the original clans of our Navajo people.
Good morning. It is 7 a.m.
Before I go any further, I want to first acknowledge that we are on the land of the Pamunkey, the Haudenosaunee, and the Piscataway. These are the tribes that lived here. They raised their families here. They hunted here. They fished here. They farmed here. They buried their ancestors here. These were the people who had society and life here long before Columbus got lost at sea. These were the tribes that were ethnically cleansed and removed from these lands so that the state of Virginia, the District of Columbia, and the state of Maryland could be founded. And I like to acknowledge the people whose land I'm standing on wherever I go around the country. First, just to honor them and to thank them for the years they've stewarded these lands. And second, to remind myself, to remind us to be more humble as we walk on these lands, acknowledging that there is a story that goes beyond the history that we've read and that we're taught in our schools. In his final State of the Union, President Obama was talking about the need in our nation for a new politics. And he said, "We the people." Our Constitution begins with these 3 simple words we've come to recognize mean all the people. Now, when I heard that, as a Native man, I had to stop and ask, when? I've read our founding documents, I've studied our history, I see the current political environment, and I had to question, when did we decide as a nation that we the people actually means all the people? Let me demonstrate. Invade, search out, capture, vanquish, and subdue all Saracens and pagans whatsoever. Reduce their persons to perpetual slavery, convert them to his and to their use and profit. These are the words of Pope Nicholas V in a papal bull written in 1452. Now, this papal bull, along with other papal bulls written between 1452 and 1493, collectively are known as what we call the doctrine of discovery. The doctrine of discovery is essentially the church in Europe saying to the nations of Europe, wherever you go, whatever lands you find not ruled by white European Christian rulers, those people are subhuman and their lands are yours for the taking. This is literally the doctrine that let European nations go into Africa, colonize the continent, and enslave the people. They didn't believe them to be human. This is the same doctrine that let Columbus, who was lost at sea, land in this new world, which was already inhabited by millions, and claimed to have discovered it. If you think about it, you cannot discover lands already inhabited. If you don't believe me, leave your cell phones, your smartphones, your car keys, your laptops out. I'll come by and discover them for you. Clearly, this is not discovery, right? This is stealing, this is conquering, this is colonizing. The fact that to this day we have a national holiday honoring Christopher Columbus as the discoverer of America reveals the implicit racial bias of the nation, which is that indigenous peoples, people of color, are not fully human. So this makes the doctrine of discovery a systemically white supremacist doctrine that assumes the dehumanization of indigenous peoples. Now, the challenge is what our founding fathers have done with this doctrine throughout our nation's history. So in 1763, King George drew a line down the Appalachian Mountains, and he said to the colonies that were here that they no longer had the right of discovery of the empty Indian lands west of Appalachia. This upset the colonies. They wanted access to those lands. So a few years later, they wrote a letter of protest. In their letter, they accused the king of raising the conditions of new appropriations of land. They went on in their letter to state that he has excited domestic insurrections amongst us and has endeavored to bring on the inhabitants of our frontiers, the merciless Indian savages. They signed their letter on July 4th, 1776. Literally 30 lines below the statement, all men are created equal, the Declaration of Independence refers to natives as merciless Indian savages, making it very clear the only reason our founding fathers used this inclusive term, all men, because they had a very narrow definition of who was actually human. This, of course, makes our Declaration of Independence a systemically white supremacist document that assumes the dehumanization of indigenous peoples. Now, a few years later, our founding fathers wrote another document. They started this one with the words, "We the people of the United States." This, of course, is the preamble to the Constitution. However, if you read just a few lines later, down to Article 1, Section 2, Article 1, Section 2 is the section of the Constitution that defines who is and who is not covered by this Constitution, who is and who is not a part of this union. If you read Article 1, Section 2, the first thing you will note is it never mentions women. This is important because if you read the entire Constitution from preamble through the 27th Amendment, you will find that there are 51 gender-specific male pronouns in regards to who can run for office, who can hold office, even who is protected by this document. 51 he, him, and his, and not a single female pronoun. So we first have to note, Article 1, Section 2 never mentions women. Second, it specifically excludes natives. And third, it counts Africans as 3/5 of a person. So who's left? Well, white landowning men is who could vote. Now, we have to ponder this for a moment. The reason our Constitution was written, the purpose of our Constitution, is to protect the interests of white landowning men. So today, we act shocked that women earn 70 cents to the dollar. This shouldn't shock us. Our Constitution is working. We act surprised that our prisons are filled with people of color. This shouldn't surprise us. Our Constitution is working. We act outraged that in 2010, the Supreme Court sided with Citizens United and rules that corporations now have the same rights to political free speech as individuals. This is what opens the door for super PACs, unlimited contributions to candidates. This shouldn't surprise us. The Constitution's doing exactly what it was designed to do, is protecting the interests of white landowning men. So this makes our Constitution a systemically white supremacist and sexist document that assumes the white landowning male has the authority to decide who is and who is not human. Now, about 50 years later, we had a Supreme Court case. This is Johnson versus McIntosh. It's two men of European descent. They're litigating over a single piece of land. One of them got the land from a native tribe, the other one got the same piece of land from the government, and they wanted to know who owned it, who had the right to sell the land. The case goes all the way to the Supreme Court. This is the Marshall Court, and they had to decide the principle upon which land titles were based. So they ruled that the principle was that discovery gave title to the land. And then they go on to reference the doctrine of discovery and rule that natives who were here first but are less than human, we only have what's called the right of occupancy to the land, like a fish would occupy water or a bird would occupy the air. And Europeans have the right of discovery to the land, the fee title to the land, and therefore they are the true title holders. This, of course, creates the legal precedent for land titles, this and a few other cases between the 1820s and 1830s. And this precedent and the doctrine of discovery are referenced by the Supreme Court in 1954, in 1985, and most recently in 2005. Now I want to talk about this 2005 case for a moment. So in 1998, the Oneida Indian Nation purchased some of their traditional lands on the open market. They paid full price for them in the state of New York, which is where they traditionally resided, and they wanted to exercise their traditional sovereignty over these lands, which would mean they were not taxable. Now, the city of Sherrill, which is where the lands resided, they wanted the tax revenue from these lands, and so they sued the Oneida Indian Nation in federal district court. The Oneida Indian Nation won that case, and the city of Sherrill appealed to the Federal Court of Appeals. The decision was upheld, and so they appealed to the Supreme Court. The case was heard in 2005, and in arguing this case, the court actually reversed the rulings of the lower courts. And in the first footnote of the case, when they're setting precedent, they reference the doctrine of discovery. They then go on to argue that given the Oneida's long delay in seeking judicial relief, we hold that the tribe cannot unilaterally revive its ancient sovereignty. They then go on to argue that it is impossible to rescind the cession and restore the Indians to their former rights because the lands have been open to settlement, which is white settlement, and large portions of them are now in the possession of innumerable innocent purchasers. Now, in the original 1823 Supreme Court cases, John Marshall is building his case. He actually refers to natives as savages. And he says, but the tribes of Indians inhabiting this country were fierce savages, whose occupation was war, and whose subsistence was drawn chiefly from the forests. To leave them in possession of their country was to leave the country a wilderness. Now, in 2005, the court makes almost the same argument. It says, moreover, the properties here involved have greatly increased in value since the Oneidas sold them 200 years ago. Notably, it was not until lately that the Oneidas sought to regain ancient sovereignty over land converted from wilderness to become parts of city like Sherrill. This is the same argument John Marshall was making. It's just not using the word savages. So the Supreme Court then concludes that we now reject the unification theory of the Oneida Indian Nation and the United States and hold that the standards of federal Indian law, which again in footnote 1 is based on the doctrine of discovery, and the federal equity practice preclude the tribe from rekindling the embers of sovereignty that long ago grew cold. This is quite possibly the most white supremacist Supreme Court decision written in my lifetime. And it was written and delivered by Ruth Bader Ginsburg. You see, white supremacy is a bipartisan value, and we don't know what to do with that. In 2016, Donald Trump won the US presidency by campaigning with a promise to make America great again. Not to be outdone, Hillary Clinton responded and told her supporters that America's great already. In October 2016, in the third presidential debate, she expanded and said, America is great because America is good. And Donald Trump concurred. He said, I agree with her. I agree with everything she just said. See, they both had a broad base of agreement. They both agreed our past, our history, which included the enslavement of African people and the genocide of Native peoples, and our foundations, which are based on the doctrine of discovery and the lie of white supremacy. They both agreed those things were great. They disagreed if we were great in 2016. Donald said no and Hillary said yes. See, we were duped. Many of us thought that the 2016 election was about racism versus anti-racism, equality versus inequality. What we were actually deciding on as a nation was, did we want Donald Trump to make America explicitly white supremacist, racist, and sexist again, or did we want Hillary Clinton to work on our behalf to keep our white supremacy and racism implicit?
What's up?
Boom. Holiday deal hunting. It's kind of our thing.
Best Buy doorbusters every Friday. You're on.
And we didn't know what to do with that. It's easier to call out that candidate, to demonize that Supreme Court nominee, to oppose that particular politician, than it is to deal with our foundations. Why? Because our foundations are what prop up our land titles. See, we would rather believe that the United States of America is racist and sexist and white supremacist in spite of our foundations. But the truth is we are white supremacist, racist, and sexist as a nation because of our foundations, and we don't know what to do with that. African Americans and women will never be included as equal until we deal with the racism and sexism embedded in our foundations. Native Americans, my people, will never be included in We the People until as a nation we deal with the doctrine of discovery and our dehumanizing legal precedent for land titles. There's an Aboriginal leader named George Erasmus, and he says where common memory is lacking, where people do not share in the same past, there can be no real community. If you want to build community, he says, you have to start by creating a common memory. I think this quote is brilliant, and it gets to the heart of our nation's problem with race, which is we don't have a common memory. We have a white majority that remembers a history, a mythological history of discovery, expansion, exceptionalism, and opportunities. And we have communities of color that have the lived experience of stolen lands, broken treaties, slavery, Jim Crow laws, boarding schools, ethnic cleansing, genocide, Indian removal, internment camps, segregation, mass incarceration, and families separated at our borders. We have no common memory, and I think we all can agree that community on a national level is absolutely in the pits. I'm proposing that the United States of America needs a national dialogue on race, gender, and class. A conversation on par with the Truth and Reconciliation Commissions that took place in South Africa, in Rwanda, and in Canada. I would call ours Truth and Conciliation, because reconciliation implies there was a previous harmony. And I think we need it sooner rather than later. My goal is 2021. Tonight, we are talking about legacy. The Iroquois did not just look 7 generations into the future. They looked 7 generations into their past. They understood that they were a part of a vast transgenerational community. And this is my challenge to you tonight. If we can learn from the wisdom of our indigenous hosts, who have been stewarding these lands for hundreds, even thousands of years, if we can acknowledge the vile racism, sexism, colonialism, and white supremacy that our founding fathers embedded deep into our foundations, and if we can pivot, we might just be able to leave a different legacy for our children's, grandchildren's, grandchildren's, grandchildren. A legacy that for the first time, we the people might actually mean all the people. Thank you very much.
They're gonna stop now.
It's done.
So what thought or idea or statement or, something you heard jumped out at you that for you to react to from what with what Mark Charles said.
Pretty much all of it.
Yeah.
It was shocking to hear that one court case
Yes.
that's been written by Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Oh my gosh, I thought it was on the side of the angels.
For sure.
I agree with that, and because we live where we live. And I grew up in Utica, which is in Oneida County, I was following that when it was happening. And somehow missed that she was the one that wrote it, I knew it came down that way, but that was a shock to me too.
So, what, anybody online have anything they wanna comment on?
Not so far.
What about some of his concepts in terms of, I assume that, I shouldn't assume the doctrine of discovery is not new to anyone here, that, what it was. And, what he said about you cannot discover lands already inhabited. And, how do you feel about that statement?
Well, certainly accurate. I mean, people are already there. Means they got there before you did. All right.
So much is embedded in our language, it's the way things were written, the way people talked, it's every day, as we all know. But this just kind of brought that home a little more, is that it's very deeply embedded. And then comes the question, well, what do we do?
I haven't been noticed this book over here, and this is one of the first books I read that sort of helped me remove whatever scales, and there were legion in my eyes. And Debbie Irving wrote this book, Waking Up White. And she lived in a good suburb in Boston, outside of Boston. And she was asking her mother, she was about 5, she loved to play cowboys and Indians. And she was asking her mother, what happened to all the Indians? I asked my mother on a Friday morning, ride home from the library. The library's main draw for me had always been a large colorful mural located high on the lobby wall. It featured 3 feathered and fringed Indians standing with 4 colonial men on a lush green lakeshore. And she just she loved to play cowboys and Indians, as I said, and where's her mother respond to it? She says whatever, Debbie asked whatever happened to all those Indians. And my mother said, sagging a little as she shook her head with something that looked like sadness, oh, those poor Indians. Why? What happened? I turned in my seat alarmed. They drank too much. She answered, my heart sank. They were lovely people, she said, who became dangerous when they drank liquor. And I mean, I heard that as a child growing up. And so,
Melinda,
yes,
I think your focus on children is spot on, and I'm wondering the value of showing this video to teachers across America. Do you know what I'm saying? Because it's got to start early so that we're not continuing to have to redo the harm of these stereotypes.
mhm. Yeah, and not only that, but also lifting up the many parts of our history that I didn't know about, the taking of the little, in order to the objective was to wipe out the Indian nation. And that's why they took the children and put them in schools that separated them from their families and prevented them from speaking their language and trying to teach them American culture and ways.
I
So,
realized
yeah,
I've never read, I know the Declaration of Independence, we the people, and I don't know that I've read any deeper into it than that. And the same with the Constitution. Neither of them are very long documents. So oh my gosh, this is what's embedded in those. Yeah.
The first time I heard this was, I don't know how many years ago, that these were systemically racist papers, documents. And I was incensed because I was still drinking the Kool-Aid of these poor Indians who apparently don't have any more because they drank. You know, in which case I guess you wouldn't have me anymore either. I won't go there. But it just is, we have, it took me a while when I came to grips with it. I realized there's so much I don't understand about the depth and the roots and the infiltration of these kinds of concepts and ideas in our society. So the Constitution, where he stated the Constitution intended to cover white landowning men. And thereby the rest of the documentation was to protect their interests. Where do you want to go with that one?
Well, we have some amendments to the Constitution which do modify that somewhat. Women can vote. Slaves are no longer. And the Bill of Rights are in there too, I think. I think there are some modifications, but I think, and I've got to go, I apologize. I'm really concerned because a lot of Supreme Court justices say very proudly they're strict constructionists. They go back to the words of the Constitution, and by golly, someone who does that can justify a whole lot. It seems really worrisome.
Can you think of any other institution that has done that exact same thing?
You didn't want to mention the church, did you?
No, I didn't.
Actually, Melinda, that brings up a comment that I have. I mean, my wife Deanna decided to go to a different place and hear an exposition on Christian nationalism. I mean, to me, this hubris is under all of this. The Bible verse, maybe, I'm sure some of you are better at exegesis than I, but no one comes to the Father except through me. I mean, okay, so Judaism and Islam already existed or exist now. So by the time of this doctrine that he's talking about in the 1400s, so I mean, we have other paths than to say that our path is the best. If we need a nation in order to feel good in our faith, I mean, what kind of faith is that if you need a nation to support it?
Interesting, that particular passage has troubled me for years because to me it was a very exclusive statement. And the more I have a particular, I particularly enjoy learning from Richard Rohr and his statement on, he's made several different statements on that. And the first one I heard him say was, well, the first thing we know is when Jesus said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. When it comes to the Father, the first thing we know is that we are not. and then there's also there's so much we do not know about what these individual statements mean. The fact that was in the book of John creates a really unique situation around its interpretation, because the book of John deals with Jesus as the Christ, risen, and he and the other Gospels do not. They deal with Jesus, and I cannot explain that to you. I'm still trying to figure that out. There's several books that are piled that await my perusal, because I can't make sense of it. But then I also realize that the point is not to make sense of it. The point is to have an open door, an open room that you can sit with and look at different ideas and see. We go feel, I get, that's one of my little doodads. So one of the things he called was subhuman people. Is that what he called?
Yeah.
Mhm.
How did you feel about that?
Sounds like an oxymoron. People, how can they be subhuman?
But do you think that exists still today, even
Oh,
once
yeah.
we have our?
Absolutely.
So all these are problems we're just exposing that we're dealing with today. And he's also said that, related to that, I thought it was interesting, he said, we can't own the land, we can only inhabit it. And, the white supremacy, he called a bipartisan value. So, he went down then also to talk about common memory, which to me was a flag for a chance to repair. And this was a way that we could get to a place that we could stop drowning in quicksand and start going in some direction. So the common memory is necessary for creating community. Any comments on that statement?
Well, if parts of society say, oh, everything is good and needs to keep going, or that things were good once and we need to get back to that. And then other people say, wait, it's never been good for us. That's a big chasm between those 2 points of view. So that needs that conciliation commission that he talked about.
So are these the elements of being woke? Are these the elements of common race theory?
I just go back to what Beth said, it's gonna continue if we don't educate the kids, because they're gonna get to our age and be learning about all this and saying, oh my goodness, I didn't realize this. So I think what Beth said is the key, to get to teachers, to get to educators, what have you with this. Parents.
I don't want to take us off the hook, right? We have to keep learning. Like, I had no idea the Canadian government engaged in a reconciliation process with the Indigenous nations. I had no idea. So I'm like Googling it right now. I think there's so much for us to learn about how other people have worked through this process in a positive way. And I'm like clueless. I don't know anything about this.
We are clueless and we want to learn. But there's a vast number of folks in this country who don't care to learn. Specifically about something that is negative about our past. So that's what's sort of disheartening and tough to grapple with is, yes, let's get to the kids, but that involves conversation and agreement and compromise. And how do we do that?
Well, a lot of the states are not wanting to bring that to the kids. They're specifically taking away the books. They're changing the histories as it was written to. They're putting Bible things in there, and the Bible verses that are used very literally in translation are become very exclusive.
For those of you who are reading the book, The Roots of White Supremacy, some of us are reading that with Rebecca. But there's so much in history. It's not just a matter of forgetting or not having learned. It's active suppression of what the history was. And that like Rebecca herself grew up in Arkansas, 70 miles from Tulsa. And she did not know about the Tulsa Race Massacre, the demolition of Black Wall Street. And she grew up 70 miles from that. And but this story is repeated over and over again in that book. And so it's what this video presented is so much consistent with what that book presents, about how we've dealt with shamefully with Native Americans. But so much of it is that suppression of history, and that's what we're seeing, of course, in not wanting to teach the history that shames you, even going to the extent of saying, if it makes the kids uncomfortable in their whiteness, we can't teach it to them. How shameful is it? Shameless, I guess. But that's, so then at the common memory, I totally resonate with what he said about that we are, I feel ashamed myself hearing some of these things. And so it has to get out to, and I agree with Beth, it needs to be all ages, because we certainly are part of that problem.
Patricia has her hand up on screen.
Oh, Patricia.
Yeah, if somebody could just read what I put in the chat. Is that possible?
Sure. Proposition 1, Equal Rights Amendment that New York passed a few weeks ago did not pass in some other states, including Florida. They needed 60% and got 57%.
No surprise.
It's impressive it got that close.
Yeah.
To bring this closer to home, I've been doing some research for our 200th anniversary. And I'm finding that we in this congregation 100 years ago gave money to Indian schools, to schools. I know, right? And so we need to know this stuff, I think.
That's interesting. That's worth exploring. So, have any of you ever encountered the circumstance where, when you're talking about this with people, neighbors, friends, strangers, that their response is, well, I wasn't there, so it didn't, what's that mentality about?
Denial.
What do you think?
I should not be held accountable for the sins of
Yeah.
those before me.
Yeah. I learned, I grew up in a neighborhood that would not allow Jewish or Black people to buy homes there. And I knew I would not have considered my family racist in the least. But the fact that I didn't know that growing up, and when I saw how, I was devastated. I swear to you, I cried for I can't tell you how long, because it wasn't, I didn't get a free pass because I didn't know about it. And so that I can't just walk away from it now, turn my back to it. I have a responsibility now to try to make that not ever happen. The common memory. What are some of the things we've heard, it's teaching things without construing the facts, keeping to them, to the kids, so that getting this information out there. What other things have we talked about? I think
one of the things that has come up in some of the anti-racism is how all of us have likely benefited from these conditions, and to realize, oh, this helped me. And what do I do emotionally and practically with that? That's a struggle.
it is a struggle. Do you think that the concept of lament enters here? Because the same thing is same process. These are just processes, different places in our society, different groups or institutions where we need to take a look and commit to, trying to understand it and figure out what we can do to remove it. And so what does lament mean? There are sounds of lament. I'm lamenting the fact that we have a divided house. Our nation is very divided right now. And I still want America to be strong. So, but what's the point of lament?
I think it's acknowledgement so that the pain that goes with acknowledging something as indicting as how we've handled indigenous people. It's so painful that lament is the start of the emotional response to our participation.
I always think of David, King David, when he was saying, "Create me a clean heart, Lord, and renew a right spirit within me." And he wanted his eyes opened so that he could see and deal with what he had done. And then go on with the things he had to do with a greater, wider look at things.
I think that's the key. I mean, lament is fine, but what do you do? Where do you go with it? Do you become an advocate? Do you find ways to address the harms that have been done? And I guess just to reflect back on this whole notion of white supremacy, I think many of us don't understand it from the standpoint of supremacy. It's the white privilege that we have and all that goes with it. From simply shopping to encounters with police and the like. We have a different standing in those environments. And how do you go about fixing that? What opens the door?
You have to lament in order to get there.
I think you have to reflect. I'm not sure lament necessarily.
That's too emotional.
Well, yes. Those of us with left brain, that's definitely not gonna work. But it does require some thinking and some real confrontation with what's happened, what our individual lives have been. Growing up in the environment we grew up in, you mentioned the fact that your neighborhood was off limits to certain people. That type of discrimination and ability to put people in places that they didn't necessarily have to be, as we've done with most of the Black population in Rochester. It's damning.
It's like I had someone say, lament with each other. When you're ready to work, come and see me.
See me.
Yeah. It might be a necessary step, but it doesn't go anywhere
Right.
beyond us and us feeling a certain way and getting to a certain place.
Get out the sackcloth
It's
and
not
ashes.
their job to get us there, is what the person was saying.
Good point.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and that's another, I think, important point. Given we have the privilege and the standing that we do, it's incumbent on us to initiate those changes. And if you're part of the indigenous community, you can, I guess, protest all you want. You can have people like Mark Charles say what he says, but until people with the power and the privilege take action, it's probably going to stay pretty much the way it is.
Well, I'm just thinking of the Trail of Tears and how we're probably getting ready to basically remove people and put them someplace else, and the parallels are amazing. And so I think we have to oppose as much as we possibly can all these activities in every sector. So it's because I think otherwise we're going to have camps again, this time with, you know, people from Venezuela, Peru, South America, and all the places that they come from.
True. Does anybody see South Pacific? Or maybe were in it when you were in high school? Anybody remember the lieutenant's song that he sang to?
You have to be carefully taught.
And as an 18-year-old, I had no finesse. I don't know what you would even call it. I was stupidly ignorant in this area and never saw it as, I heard it, but it didn't take root until years later. And gotta be taught to be afraid of people whose eyes are oddly made, people whose skin is a different shade. Got to be carefully taught. Gotta be taught before it's too late, before you're 6 or 7 or 8. Got to be carefully taught. But so this is what, so if we were to work toward a common memory, there's a organization that Mark Charles has tried to introduce, and I haven't been very successful at this point in trying to get any documentation. You remember he notioned he gave us until 2021 to work on this intro, the Truth and Conciliation 2021, and there is a YouTube, a couple YouTube videos about it, but they're hard to find. But it is an alive and well concept, even though it's 2024. And I think we've all been exposed, from what I hear you all saying, we've all been exposed to the different suggestions of what we can do in our own sphere of influence, our own communities, how we can act. And I keep hearing little groups being suggested to form that we can work together just on, in our places. So it took us a long time to get here. How long is it going to take us to get out?
Well, this is Pat on things. It's kind of right in our face right now, what's happening around us, and the movement towards that conservative view of going back in time. Economically, they want to put us back with programs that are at the turn of the 1800s. So when we talk about the discovery doctrine or doctrine of discovery, it's being promoted at this point almost. And it's a significant issue. And again, it only starts at the personal level as best we can, is to start talking to people that we know who aren't quite understanding the depth of this new reality that has been created, such that we can move forward. It's going to take a lot of work.
Yeah.
So that's.
I totally agree with Pat. Like, that's our challenge. I also am am mindful of the importance of lifting up Native voices and lifting up every little thing we do to foster recognition of Native voices. And I'm wondering, Ruth, do you want to talk about what the Presbytery's Racial Justice Group funded in the Onondaga Nation this past summer?
Yes, there's a camp that is run by the Ganongan group, and they take youth who just have not been very much exposed to their culture. And they spend a week at the camp and they live the life of Native people. The dishes that they cook are Native dishes. The language that they hear is Native language. The skills that they develop are the skills that Native Americans developed. So they get a deep immersion into the culture that they came from. And we just got the final report of the last summer's camp that we partially funded. And it really is heartwarming to read the extent to which the youth did not know much of anything and felt that they had really been exposed to their culture in ways that would stay with them forever. And they're more likely to work for their culture in ways that they just weren't aware existed. So it was one of our 11 projects that focused on Native Americans.
Wow, that sounds wonderful.
They had me when they revealed in a video we saw about it that the first thing the kids had to do was give up their phones for a week. And they couldn't have any processed sugar for a week, only Native foods. It was stunning. So I think measures like those are equally important, you know, lifting up Native voices and also reckoning with our family, our church, our history. Yeah. I'm going to scoot over to third. I'll see you guys soon.
See you in a bit. So you mentioned, go ahead, right?
This conversation brings up for me a dilemma. Is that to the extent we honor individual cultures, individual communities, at the same time we're seeking to break down the divisions, the barriers that exist between different. So I find that tension in that discussion sometimes is that the goals in the Declaration of Independence and Constitution sound laudable to me still. It's just a question of how do you define who are we the people? It's similar to our theological question of who is your neighbor. You know, it's and yet there are different neighborhoods, which I think most of us would say we do want to honor the culture and tradition of those neighborhoods. But then there's the more universal question of who is your neighbor. And I think that tension is underneath all of this and has for the history of mankind, so that we can't obliterate that we're trying to improve our situation, but it's in some ways we're fighting against the tide of what human nature for its whole history has displayed in terms of how we seek divisions and separation and the unique little communities that are different than the rest. So I find that a difficult discussion myself.
So there are several areas that we need to look at with open eyes and open hearts. He started this talk by saying that we were made to be in his tradition, Danae. They were stewards and taught to be stewards and humble in dealing with our land and dealing with the concepts of neighbor. And so that's biblical as well. I mean, so how do we, what does that say to us as Christians in terms of how because we have the same microcosm, I think. I'm glad to be proven wrong, please do. that we have the same microcosm in our church hierarchy. This whole thing came down from the Catholic Church in, what was it, 14, whatever, 52. And, so I mean, we're just intricately related. I don't think we're gonna solve any problems. But I would, encourage you to maybe find more about, if I find more about it, I'll send information out about this it's hashtag TCC 2021, which is Truth and Conciliation. But, I do have from our anti-racism stuff, to me, this is a process. And it feels like every single thing we're doing today in terms of learning after discovering where we are and coming to grips with where we are, that becomes a walk or a process to get where we want to go. And so this was a Franciscan benediction that we discovered, shall we say, or was given to us in one of our trainings. So it is, may God bless us with discomfort, that easy answers, half-truths, and superficial relationships, so that we may live from deep within our hearts. May God bless us with anger at injustice, oppression, and exploitation of God's creations, so that we may work for justice, freedom, and peace. May God bless us with tears to shed for those who suffer pain, rejection, hunger, and war, so that we may reach out our hands to comfort them and to turn their pain into joy. And may God bless us with just enough foolishness to believe that we can make a difference, so that we can do what others claim cannot be done, to bring justice and kindness to all our children and all our neighbors who are poor. And if we take a look at the word poor, we all are poor in one way or another. So I would wish you to see this as a process, to see this as a journey, to see this as a walk, that it's one thing to learn and study and become more acquainted with what's actually happening. But it's equally important to act in your own way, in whatever circumstances interest you and come and confront you, happen to come your way. So onward.
I also want to thank you for organizing and doing this, because I recently joined Third Church this fall, as many of you know, and it is such a pleasure to be among people who share my values and who speak out and who do the things that I've seen you do since I joined. So thank you.
This is our spiritual, or no, what do we call it here?
Adult spiritual formation. But you stepped up to the need for
I
today.
did, and I saw this, I said, this is down my alley. But then I didn't realize I bought this, but it's Unsettling Truths, the ongoing dehumanizing legacy of the doctrine of discovery, and it's by Mark Charles, and he co-authored it with Sun Ra.
Oh, I was talking to my cat. I just want to say, at some point we need to not be afraid to talk about reparations, whatever that means. I think there's some fear of people getting into disagreements, and I'm not specifically talking about giving people gobs of money or anything, but I hope that discussion of reparations and what that could mean are somewhere in our near future.
I believe that's included in this particular vignette, look at the lens of looking at this with the coming up with conciliation. You know, it's not reparations necessarily with money, but how to get the full story out, the true story. As much as one has a true story. So anyway, this is a very interesting book. It dialogues along with this video. And thank you for coming. Thank you.
Thank you.